And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, you know, they used to say live and let live.
Mm-hmm.
But in this ever changing world in which we're living, they say live and let die.
Yep.
And that is apparently the attitude of the Secret Service towards former President Trump and quite likely future President Trump. Now, the Secret Service director came out and gave one of the most disastrous press conferences I've ever seen. Lots of platitudes, lots of nonsense, and some key quotes that I'm going to read here that are just absolutely absurd on the face of it, that they would be 3 weeks into this now, as of tomorrow, and not have the answers for the public. This guy was doing all the stonewalling and giving us all the platitudes like, oh, our heart is in it, and oh, we were all so down after the event. We want to know why the Secret Service was ordered to stand down so that President Trump could be shot by a Patsy. And Patsies are the theme tonight. After all, tonight's episode is a special report, the Patsy profile. And this is now Assassinations as Deep Events. This brings us into all kinds of interesting territory. And when we get there, I want to say something about the Patsies themselves, which is very often from Oswald to Sirhan to Crooks to Hinckley, Mark David Chapman, others. You know, it's an incredibly sad life, really, to think of all the things that they did to being moved into position. And the study of their lives is particularly interesting for patterns that arise where we see from an early period they're easily influenceable and also have certain types of, you know, well, I guess they're easy to brainwash. That would be one way to put it. And they're the patterns that are set up, they think that they're moving their lives forward in some particular fashion. But what's actually taking place is the intel agencies are taking advantage of their lack of position and giving them a false sense of identity. And it's funny because if you go back into periods like the 60s and 70s, you can see in the popular culture, they understood this quite well. We've fallen out of it over the past couple of decades. And now you see, you know, along with this awareness that is rising to the surface, you also see a lot of junk conspiracy mixed with it, so you never know what to think. And you will find that breakdown that we often do on this show, which is the official story, which is full of holes, and then the secondary story, which is brought forward by researchers, professors, writers, and others who see the obfuscation that's taking place. And then what happens is a force comes in and feeds the junk conspiracy underneath so that people don't know what to think. And they've been in overdrive on that front lately. But right now, on the Crooks case, what they're trying to do is present a narrative and pick up all these threads so they can play it off as the lone nut routine, and that, oh, wasn't it a shame that the Secret Service, with all that, you know, incredible surveillance technology, with all those billions of dollars, with all that training, just missed this kid on a roof with a rifle. Absolutely absurd. And the Secret Service director's statements today, not very encouraging. By a long shot, there's a deep state actor protecting a deep state operation. That's just, you can't get around that. And I want to say individually, of course, for the people involved, for me, the people involved in the actual planning operate on a totally cloaked, clandestine level. So we're not looking at them when we're dealing with their counterparts or their the people who are doing the dirty work for them. So very often, you know, you'll find people who are being given orders and being given instructions for things, and you'll find that they have a background that goes into a particular end of the government that doesn't have any oversight. And this is the continuity of government group. And you're going to find in the Secret Service story around this event and every deep event in history in America, this continuity of government group active since the 1940s. This is something, of course, we've picked up on the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott, who gave us the term deep state deep events, and designated culprit, which is the perfect term for the Patsy. And it's very interesting, the patterns that he established, which we'll get into some of those tonight. Those designated culprits need to be off the radar just before the deep event takes place. So the regular agencies, the FBI and the CIA, need to move those guys into the background. So somebody like the CIA can say, well, they weren't on our radar, so what were we supposed to do? And the designated culprit is enabled to be in a position so that he won't be obstructed from being the perfect patsy. And in this case, Crooks is serving the role there. Although my own determination after 3 weeks of investigation on this, there's going to be a lot more. There's a lot of people doing investigating. And even some of the official sources, have to give ground on the things that people saw. There's a big game about trying to drag along certain witness testimony to the official version. It doesn't wash, and I'll show you how tonight. We're going to be taking your questions, of course. And before I go any further tonight, I want to mention that if you're new here, I want you to sign up for our newsletter at darkjournalist.com. We've been experiencing the kind of censorship, they made a big deal. Elon did this thing on Twitter where he's like, if you type in Donald Trump assassination, you get all these Kamala results. Well, let me tell you, boy, are we used to that.
Yep.
You type in dark journalist, you get CNN left and right. And so this was kind of funny to see people reenacting this and say, hey, the search bar fills out this way. Well, welcome to our world. But that is true. And it does constitute a kind of interference, election interference on behalf of the search engine. Should be called into question, no doubt about it. We're also seeing a reversion to 2020 style. You're going to notice this more and more. That type of suppression of stories that was going on during COVID, which they eased up on for a little while. The censorship is heavy and thick in the air as we get into this election season, which is also a season of assassination, which was the episode we did last week. So you're signed up for the newsletter. The other thing that we're going to do tonight is take questions, like I said. So we're only going to go about 90 minutes tonight. This is a special report on the Patsy profile. And we're going to show how that template is being used across the board again. That has been in place for a good 60, 70 years with highs and lows. I do think there's an opportunity here for the Congress to get to the bottom of a number of these things and to pull the plug on this apparatus. And I'm going to get into that as well. On the questions front, you can ask the questions now even, and Miss Olivia will put them together for the last half hour of the show. Before I go any further, what do you got there?
Well, a lot of people were talking about part 2 of your talk with Joseph.
Yes.
And Elizabeth said part 2 was a must-see. It opened a lot of possibilities not to be missed. Blessings. And Michael Matika said part 2 was bonkers. Joseph Tuga says, yeah, the latest member material was uber potent and poignant.
Let me tell you, this is a very special episode called Berkner's Secret, where we get into what was going on with Lloyd Berkner, this kind of very, very mysterious character who seems to wind his way through all these major events in history, and his association with President Kennedy. It's quite fascinating because he walks in these worlds of the UFO file, Antarctica, politics, and he's interfacing with the very highest level characters. The thing about Berkner is I was able to bring forward some research on him last year that nobody had dug up. And now we've put together a 6-part documentary series coming up this fall on Berkner. So that'll be available for subscribers first. But the kickoff event for the whole thing was this episode we did with Dr. Farrell. And let me tell you, Dr. Farrell had a line of research that overlapped directly into what we were doing with Berkner. And it is a potent, and I mean potent, combination that I think a lot is going to come out in terms of the type of special technology, weapons, and other things related to nuclear power, breakthrough energy, and the UFO file. These things are coming to the fore and they're breaking through. And that episode is a good kind of kickoff, getting us ready for the series, which will kick off in September. So thank you to everyone. It's been tremendous feedback on that one. The order of the day. Let's get into the Secret Service side because it's going to give us the opening into all the inconsistencies around Thomas Matthew Crooks, the alleged assailant who took a shot, and the late assailant, I should say, who took a shot at President Trump, and he did actually shoot him in the head, but he missed going, with the kill shot, and he got him on his ear, and it was very interesting because the FBI and the Secret Service director have had to now go on the record saying that, but they were tampering around for a little while saying, we don't know what it was. It might have been shrapnel. They wanted to lessen the whole impact of this thing, and they have been falling into their own trap on that as well. Rowe, the Secret Service director now, after the exit of Cheadle. Now, Cheadle, of course, was Dick Cheney's Secret Service woman, dragged him into the COG bunker during 9/11. This guy also worked on a 9/11 task force with the Secret Service. He also has the 9/11 connection. He, in his statements, was deceptive, deflective. It was one of the worst things. But I'm going to show you one very interesting example. And let's just see if we can trek with this as we get into it. Now, the reporter asks, I have a follow-up. Could you describe, you said there were 100 calls for support of the Secret Service during the event. Who did the calls come from, and what did they look like? Do you anticipate any different changes in protocol between how Secret Service communicates or works with local law enforcement? And Rose says, thank you for that question. With regards to calls for support, it was a very hot day and there was a lot of EMS calls to address people, but there were people that needed some other type of law enforcement assistance. Let me tell you, this doesn't have anything to do with the Secret Service at all. So this was instantly a red flag in his answers. He's trying to just say, oh, we were so overloaded and overburdened by 100. First of all, do you really think in that event there were 100 different distress calls to the Secret Service? And then why would they be going to the Secret Service for people passing out from heat? Wouldn't happen. So this is odd right off the bat. And then he starts to talk about how the radio communications didn't work between the Secret Service and local law enforcement. This is absurd, and it goes along with something that people are discovering based on his testimony earlier to Congress. And that committee, through the figure of Josh Hawley, got some very important things out there. And I have Hawley's whistleblower statement here I'm going to read in a minute, which I think is particularly powerful. Hawley releases new whistleblower claims alleging Secret Service director's role in scaling back agencies' manpower, retaliating against agents who speak out. They cut the security for the president during this event, and that needs to be answered. It's a crucial question. It's not just, oh, it was an oversight. This is real conscious activity. Somebody in that chain is giving those orders. Don't forget it for a moment. All right. So now what's interesting is they're saying, how is it that you didn't pick up these calls? You have a policeman supposedly standing on the shoulders of another policeman, and he calls in and says there's a guy on the roof with a rifle, and you didn't hear it. He's calling into the same radio channel, and they're like, oh, we're tuned into a different radio channel. And then it turns out that there's no records of any of their radio calls from the Butler incident on the Secret Service side. Let me tell you, the red flag of going back to 1963 of the Kennedy assassination is that all the White House communications using the emergency channel by the Secret Service, all of those were kept and left out of the Warren Commission, left out of the different congressional hearings in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the rest of it. And the reason that they can do that is because the COG emergency network operates in a protected channel. So you can do all kinds of things with it. Oliver North used it to move missiles to Iran and send the profits back to the Contras in the 1980s. So the COG network, which they call the Doomsday Network, is so well protected that you're able to use it and not have any track of the calls, etc. So that was the red flag for me. Now, I haven't got it confirmed that they were using the COG network, but how are they going to explain that all of their radio communications are gone? This is going to be one of the key and most important pieces in his flailing around in these answers. Check this out. I think we're going to bring in some state and local law enforcement. The interoperability challenge, it's not an easy fix. It's not as simple as just trying to figure out the local frequency of the agency you're working with. Let me tell you, none of this stuff means anything to these guys. They've been doing this for years, for decades. They've figured out all the radio channels. There is no conflict on their side. So this is all BS. The reason he was coming out with this BS today, more blocking like Cheadle was doing before she stepped down, tells me that the agency itself is in trouble here, and they're being hung out. They're just hanging out there, and he's doing his best to deflect. Now, it's interesting also because he is saying, oh, don't worry, going forward, we're going to do all these things with all of the right amount of heart, he keeps saying. And don't worry, we didn't fire anybody yet, but we're not going to rush to judgment. And now he keeps using this term rush to judgment. And it's weird because Mark Lane's, of course, rush to judgment was the original critique of the Warren Commission. So his use of this phrase, again, you have to always watch for the steganography going forward. A couple of other weird things he said here. He said, from now on, we're going to be using high tech to make sure this doesn't happen. And, oh, we weren't able to coordinate a drone or that. Really, the Secret Service with billions of dollars, the best surveillance mechanism on the planet. You can't fly a drone over Butler, Pennsylvania. So it's just, it's lies within lies, and very thick lies. And when we get into those types of lies, then you know that they're in trouble, because that's, something anybody can figure out. The media, of course, let them off the hook again and again, but occasionally there were a few piercing questions. I'm going to get to these here. Now, they ask him again to kind of justify the fact that nothing was going on here in relation to them responding to these calls. And he said, we did not have access to certain information. It's not anybody's fault. Well, certainly it's somebody's fault. I mean, it's somebody's fault, right? If you weren't getting the police calls telling you that there's a shooter on the roof, then somebody is at fault. It just happened there was a sense of urgency that there might have been radio traffic that we missed. Oh, really? You're missing radio traffic. That's your job. It doesn't make any sense. These answers are like some of the most beyond absurd answers I've ever heard. We have to do a better job of that. In addition to this task force, we'll provide more information on it next week as we begin to stand that up. I've also directed all our special agents in charge of field offices across the country to reevaluate where we put our security rooms. All right. So this is all packaged response. And the Secret Service has been doing this job, since the 19th century. So the idea that they're going to reevaluate and use high tech now, and they have tremendous access to things that we couldn't even dream of in terms of surveillance, thermographic imagery, all kinds of X-ray equipment, long distance cameras, spotters, things you wouldn't even believe. And very often, even in the 1950s and 60s, they would go to sites days before the event. So everything he's giving us here is complete deep state blocking. The question is, why? Now, just to really kind of put this across, they asked as a follow-up on all this, they wanted to know, and they felt like he was deflecting. So they said, did you get reports of the shooter on the roof? Basically, yes or no? And he said, we did not. It did not make it over to us. Oh, really? So you have a shooter on the roof and you didn't have any report of it. You didn't see it yourself and you didn't hear about it. It's absolutely absurd. We did not hear it. It did not make it over to us. It did not make it to us. I go back to my opening statement where the members of the detail did not. All they knew was there's some issue that the locals were working on. Yeah, sure. Complete deep state deflection and absurd. Now, here's one reason this might be going on, and it goes to the Hawley question. Now, Senator Josh Hawley is from Missouri, and he is the Republican leading this kind of commission on studying what took place here. He's also, when he's shown up at the site in Butler, he was rebuffed by the FBI, who said, quote, we don't want you here. Now, that's weird because that shows a power struggle inside of representative government versus these agencies who want to be free to do whatever they want to do. I found that particularly hostile. Today, U.S. Senator Josh Hawley sent a letter to Acting Secret Service Director Ronald Rowe after new whistleblower claims point to his actions as reason for the agency's failures to protect former President Donald Trump. Quote, since your testimony before the Senate of July 30th, new and disturbing information has come to light about Secret Service planning for the Butler, Pennsylvania campaign event and your own involvement. Now, this is interesting because he's directly involved in setting up what was going on there. He's the one who participated in the security stripping as well. So, what's interesting here is he may have to fire himself to get to the bottom of this. The whistleblower further alleges that you personally directed significant cuts to CSD up to and including, this is the security detail, up to and including reducing the division's manpower by 20%. That's pretty major during a campaign season. The whistleblower also alleges retaliation against those within the Secret Service who expressed concern about the security of President Trump's events. So these people are under instructions to reduce the security, and they're basically, the people giving those instructions are hoping something is going to happen there. There's no question about it. They're culpable and they're responsible. And so the whistleblowers now, the crisscross is on. Interestingly enough, local authorities are also pushing back against the stories that the Secret Service is telling, saying that's not the way things went down at all. So we're getting into an area here, which is, you're at the deep face, the kind of interface of these deep influences. And what we need to do is start to see, who are the people that they roll out there to play protection. And in this case, I think we're getting quite an interesting character with Rowe for a couple of reasons. The 9/11 detail that he was a part of, I think, is interesting also because it gives him something in common with Cheadle. A little more from Hawley in his letter. A whistleblower has alleged to my office that the Secret Service Counter-Surveillance Division, CSD, the division that performs threat assessment at event sites before the event occurred, did not perform its typical evaluation of the Butler site and was not present on the day. This is significant because CSD's duties include evaluating potential security threats outside the security perimeter and mitigating those threats during the event. Now, it goes on with a laundry list of things that this whistleblower alleges. Here's what's interesting. If the whistleblower has it right, the team that was supposed to secure the event space before the event never showed up. That's a dramatic lapse, and it represents that kind of security stripping. I want to take us all the way back to the assassination of President Kennedy for a moment, because a very similar type of tug of war took place. Somehow, the Secret Service escaped the scrutiny, but they were under the very same direct orders to lower the security. And in that case, we had absolutely tragic results. But we know that certain factions inside of the deep state structure were popping champagne corks. Now, it's interesting to me because the Secret Service, there have been exposés around the Secret Service and the culture of the Secret Service. I think that that is one problem that takes place. But the other problem is the interface that goes on. And if you read some of the exposés, including from Abraham Bolden, who was the first Black Secret Service agent that President Kennedy put in the detail, and he had tremendous, and I mean tremendously bad feedback for the Secret Service activity going on in Dealey Plaza back then. He was subsequently put in jail on a false bribery charge for which he was recently pardoned some 60 years later. Quite interesting, remarkable story. But one of the things that Bolden pointed out was that the strange interfacing of the Secret Service with Interpol, and Interpol, international police that's plugged into all kinds of deep state activity, and they take a headquarters in France and, of course, in New York. But they operate very much in league with the Central Intelligence Agencies and other intelligence agencies. And so that we can see part of the the interface and the problem when you're going into these areas of the Secret Service is there are going to be these tentacles that reach in, and you'll be looking to say, well, it's this Secret Service person or it's this particular process that they use that caused the failure. And we won't be realizing that something else is operative in the middle of all this. That's why looking at the specific cases and the Patsies involved is going to help us. I'm going to try to do all that in this report tonight, even though it's going to be a shorter report than normal. So we'll be probably done by around 10 o'clock. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going deep tonight on the Patsy Profile Assassination Deep Events. And certainly 3 weeks later, we are looking at no answers from the Secret Service on this. And we're in a season where, an assassination season, as we said last week. So there may well be another attempt. So getting the expose right on what they did wrong here is going to be absolutely crucial. But looking at the Patsy is going to give us a window into some of that. I want to also mention to you, if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, our free newsletter. That's going to guarantee that you actually know the shows are coming and all the exciting things that we have coming up for you. We've been experiencing quite a backlash of censorship on this channel, and with the things we're reporting, I think it must be particularly amped up because of the election. But wow, it's been heavy. The best way to get around it is to sign up for the newsletter and make sure you get that in your inbox every week. And we have such exciting things coming up for you for August and September that you're going to want to stand up and be counted and make sure you're on that list. Okay. Let me go back here. I want to show, sometimes when I talk about the Secret Service stand down, I'm going to almost be obnoxious here and show you the same thing about 5 times in a row, just to really hammer it home. Because occasionally you'll hear all kinds of excuses for the Secret Service actions in Dealey Plaza. And I'm going to show you how the most important thing that they had going on during the Dealey Plaza motorcade of President Kennedy was the fact that the agents came off the back of his limo to open him up to 2 lines of fire. That means, the target's not going to escape. So when they usher President Kennedy into ambush in Dealey Plaza, they are leaving no doubt that he's going to be eliminated. He cannot be allowed to escape. And it's quite interesting to me because whenever you study it over the years, a little bit comes out over time about this agent or that agent. And what I find particularly interesting is that it's right at Love Field when President Kennedy is heading into Dealey Plaza that they order the Secret Service stand down. There's a video of it. And what I'm going to do is probably for next week, I'm going to put together a video presentation because there's so many moving parts and videos. And I'm not going to play those. I'm just going to show you pictures of it tonight. But next week, I'll put together something that shows us contrast in the video information because the video captures certain things. I think a lot of video came forward from the Crooks event that really sums things up. Another thing that came out of the Crooks event is this video that was on Fox News recently showing basically the shooter in full view of everyone walking back and forth across that roof. So the Secret Service, as we already knew, couldn't have missed him. Here's a traditional setup for President Kennedy's public events in 1963. So you've got the Secret Service on the back of the limo. Let's see if I can point this out here and keep the mic intact. These guys here are standing on the back. They have places to stand. That's their normal security position. The idea is whoever would be firing at the president, not only do they have a better bird's eye view of what's going on, but they also would actually be in a blocking position so that actually you can't shoot through them. It's very hard for anyone to get a decent shot or a decent angle. That's why the positions were created in the first place. And they have these runners, these handles that are on the back here, and they're holding on to those, and you'll see them throughout. The only place during the entire Texas trip where they come off is in Dealey Plaza. These guys disappear. So that's part of the security stripping. Over the years, there have been a lot of people researching what took place and how they got ordered off. But it turned out it was the shift supervisor, Emery Roberts, who ordered them to come out. Now, there's a classic video, which is called Odd Secret Service Behavior in the JFK motorcade. And this is floated around in different ways. I've seen very high-res versions of it. You know, it comes directly from CBS News. And during this, this leaving for Love Field towards Dealey Plaza, the agents go to get on the back, and they're going to get on that position and hold on to that handle and provide the president the extra security like they always do. So they're ordered off here, and they're upset about it. And the agents involved said, I don't get what's going on. The arrow here is pointing to the other officer, agent, who has been told to get back in the car. And he's being told that by Emery Roberts, who's the director here. This agent is really protesting, saying, we never do this. What are you talking about? And so this was part of the real original Secret Service stand down. You'll hear about this with JFK once in a while. It took place directly before the incident, and it's very indicative that the Secret Service were a part of this. Now, I told you I was going to be obnoxious and show you the handles over and over again. Look at this. Okay, that is the same limo with a different plate there, because the original plate is GG300, but it's the same limo, and you can see clearly the handles on the back and the place for the agents to stand on. As we're leaving Love Field here, you can see that the agents are gone, and so what does that do? Suddenly the president is opened up in the rear directly now. So there's nobody standing back there for those shots. When you get into Dealey Plaza, you can see the agents that would ordinarily be riding on the back of the president's limo or riding on the side of the backup car here. So in the front limo, they're gone. There's nobody back there. So where those agents should be is directly behind the president here. They're not there. They're missing. Another shot that gives us more of this is here. Now this shows how, in terms of the rear shooting, if you had two guys on there, nobody from the rear would have been able to shoot anything. So it would have been obvious that all the shots were coming from the front. And you can see here, that's the president's limo here. There's nobody there. The agents that should be there are literally gone. And it's interesting because if you look 1 second before the president is assassinated, you can see that this handle, let me see if I got it. That's it. This handle right here. That's where an agent should be. So no shots would get through if there's an agent there. And of course, a wider view from the top, it's very easy to see. That's the open, vulnerable position. Now, this is what you do when you are riding somebody into ambush. You strip off their security, you ride the king into an ambush. Now, what's interesting is after the shots are all fired, one of the agents runs after the limo and he jumps on that position, which somebody should have been on in the first place. And you can see right here, this handle right here, that's where the other agent should be. This guy has just run up to it, so there was nobody on the back of that limo. It's absolutely crucial to understand the stripping that took place inside of Dealey Plaza to understand why we're in this situation now, where we can have this long-term questioning of the Secret Service at this press conference and still be getting these completely BS answers. There's no question in my mind that the Secret Service was ordered to stand down. The question is, who ordered them to do it? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the Dark Journalist X special report, the Patsy profile, assassination and deep events. We're going deep into the process of the Secret Service assassination and then the Patsies that they use to perform these to kind of absolve everyone looking at this and to do all the thinking for them. And one of the things that they kind of figured out is they could always rely on this lone nut disgruntled person, and people could always say, well, there was some nut in the crowd and he did it. Now, of course, in regular political life, you do have disgruntled people and you have nuts and people who just want to take a shot at somebody, but they're not able to do that because of the kind of security that's provided to the president. And that's an art form, and they've developed it through many, many decades, through many, many trainings, through many, many incidents, and with billions and billions of dollars and the highest technology that you can imagine. So everything, I found the press conference offensive today, and it was the last nail in the coffin of the official story for me about what they were doing. I'm going to deconstruct part of that official story here tonight through the figure of Thomas Matthew Crooks as well, and getting into his counterparts through history. But one of the last things I wanted to show you and keep it in mind for later is something I've pointed out about the continuity of government players. They're always involved around deep events. So during the Kennedy assassination, we had Winston Lawson, who came directly out of that continuity of government machinery. He was the Secret Service agent who set up the Dealey Plaza run, and he was using the Doomsday Network during the shooting. Now, that's unusual. Secret Service has all kinds of channels. Nobody uses that emergency network. They don't use the Doomsday Network unless a doomsday incident takes place. So the fact that he was using it meant he didn't want anyone else to know. They didn't want any track or trail of what they were saying to each other. So they literally could have been using the Doomsday Network during the shooting as a way to coordinate the shooters. You know, you got him here, you got him there. You need to take another shot. You've gone a little further down the road. So Lawson has always been an interesting character, and Professor Scott has pointed out that he lied extensively in his regular testimony about how he was setting up things, who was there, the amount of motorcycles, the whole thing over and over again. When we go through his testimony, it's loaded with lies. Interestingly enough, through the last 6 decades, we have this group in the continuity of government over and over again showing up in these deep events. And in this deep event, we have the character of Cheadle, and now with the current Secret Service director, we have the 9/11 overlay. I'm not sure if he was associated with COG or not, but we're going to find out. This should be part of the congressional hearing into Secret Service. What role is COG playing here? Because they've been involved in so many of these. This is where the real conversation, I think, could open up, and we could get to the bottom of some of it. But somebody is a master, and I mean a master of psychological warfare in the creation of the Patsies. And that's what's going to be such a crucial level on this tonight. Now, I'm going to go to a statement by the director of Homeland Security, Mayorkas. And you have to kind of imagine here that Homeland Security, very much like the Central Intelligence Agency, is extra constitutional. It's extra legal. It's not envisioned in constitutional law or principles. There's no, hey, invent this agency with 250,000 people and, give them wireless warrants and wiretapping. This whole kind of approach is absurd and gets us further and further out. Now, a lot of these things took place with the advent of the Patriot Act, which came directly out of the 9/11 event. And then we had the continuity of government activated during 9/11. It has to be understood that these things are all connected, because the further and further away you get from representative government and democratic principles, the more and more the emergency powers, continuity of government people kick in. They're not voted in. There's no voting mechanism to have them in. They're selected, and they're brought into this mechanism, which has tremendous power. So it needs to be part of the conversation when they're doing this to say, how is this related to your work in continuity of government? And isn't it unusual that we have so many continuity of government players involved? It's interesting because Cheadle herself mentioned continuity of government kind of out of the blue in the middle of her testimony, and it was out of context. So for me, it was kind of like, waving the flag, like, don't ask me any more questions. I'm COG. So Mayorkas, who heads up this extra constitutional Homeland Security, which has 250,000 employees versus, say, 30,000 or less at CIA, and it's just a sweeping kind of, not very well regulated organization. They put that in charge of Secret Service. This is also something that they should get into in the commission, looking into this, to say, should we even have Secret Service be part of Homeland Security? Because you can have a lot more corruption in a structure with 250,000 people. Now, Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas released the following statement regarding the appointment of Ronald Rowe Jr. as acting director of the U.S. Secret Service. I think some of these comments are interesting. Quote, I've appointed United States Secret Service Deputy Director Ronald Rowe to serve as acting director of the Secret Service. Director Rowe has been Deputy Director of Secret Service since April 2023. 24-year veteran of the Secret Service. He previously served as Assistant Director of Intergovernmental and Legislative Affairs, Deputy Assistant Director for the Office of Protective Operations, and in other leadership positions. I appreciate his willingness to lead the Secret Service at this incredibly challenging moment as the agency works to get to the bottom of exactly what happened during the July 13th incident and cooperate with ongoing investigations in this heightened threat environment. Now, then he says this, quote, the Secret Service is the greatest protective service in the world. Now, if it's so great, how did they allow somebody, a lone nut with a rifle on a roof 150 yards or less from President Trump, to take a shot that would have taken his life? So obviously they're not. And if they were, that's the biggest damning kind of confession right there. We're the greatest security agency in the world, which means you had to have stood down during that incident. There's no getting around it. Now, here's the other weird spin that's been going on. This is interesting. Local law enforcement isn't agreeing with what Secret Service is saying about the incident. So now we're getting two different versions of what took place. And I'm going to follow these parallel versions. But I find this interesting. Secret Service chief comments on Trump rally response probe. Local law enforcement officials accuse agency of misleading comments. This is a split. This is not, the official story isn't going to hold. These guys were on the ground. They know that they contacted people. They know the people on the radio responded, So I think you're going to see a lot more of this, and you're going to see the attempt to button this up. And make no mistake that the floating of Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, as somebody who would be overseeing the entire investigation of the local law enforcement side, being floated as a potential VP for Harris, I think gives us cause for pause. And there's no question that the Democrats would need Pennsylvania in order to win, but it's just a weird coincidence, is it not? I give you that one, Miss Olivia. What do you got out there?
David Tormita says, of course we know JFK was most likely shot from the front. So why would they need to move the Secret Service agents off the limo? Because they would not be able to explain the magic bullet if they were there. And Joseph Tuga says, this time around, Secret Service was staffed with incompetent personnel instead of calling them off the target.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. They still wanted triangulated crossfire in the Kennedy situation, which is why you have the very strange location of Dealey Plaza. There's no way they would have taken any other president through there. It's a very unusual turn. The logistics of the place are dramatic. There's no question about it. And when you remove the security from the back, then you can say, oh, all the shooting took place from the back, and that's the way to rub out the entire thing. But you also get the possibility of the triangulated shooting. So there's lots of reasons to do it. And that's really fascinating. What else you got?
Joseph Tuka says, the old bait and switch with the new head of Secret Service shuts down inquiry. Must have been the plan all along. Rehoboth Farm says, Rowe was a staffer for Biden in the Senate and as vice president, long-term Biden creature. Joseph Fabry says, Rowe is the epitome of a swamp creature.
Oh, absolutely. I think he proved that today. And watch more for this phony language of like, oh, how gut-wrenching this was, and we're all heart, protection's what we do, just a lot of weird blank slogans. I got an idea for Roe. Just answer the questions and, um, be prepared for legal action based on your answers because he's lying heavily. And, that's a big problem. I would think if anyone, if Trump got into office, I think the first thing they should do is remove that whole upper echelon of the Secret Service. Now, here's another piece of the story. I mentioned the whistleblower. So it's getting around here. The whistleblower alleges that the Secret Service Counter Surveillance Division, which was in charge of inspecting event locations beforehand, was not present at the rally and never conducted a typical evaluation prior to the event. If that turns out to be true, then they're not going to be able to prevent a deeper investigation. So that's the one to watch, which is that whistleblower, I believe, has them right where he wants them on that. This is interesting. It's just a little background on Roe himself and his incredibly limp response, as I've been mentioning. But here's a little more of it. Deputy Director of the Secret Service, Ronald Rhodes, stated, upon assuming the role of acting director, will rebuild Americans' public trust and confidence, as well as the trust placed in us to protect them. Acting Director Rowe testified before the Senate Homeland Security Judiciary Committee this week regarding the security failures of his service to protect the former president. He stated, "What I saw made me ashamed. As a career law enforcement officer, a 25-year veteran with the Secret Service, I cannot defend why that roof was not better secured." So what he's admitting, just like Mayorkas, in a kind of by what they're not saying is there's no way it could have not been covered. Therefore, it was not covered on purpose. Quote, "We were told that building was going to be covered," the acting director said. "I could not and will not, and I cannot understand why there was not better coverage or at least somebody looking at that roof line when that's when they were posted, when that's where they were posted." So he has all kinds of weird things going on there. He's saying, nobody told us, and I don't understand it, and all this nonsense. So the official story on this is the Secret Service, for some reason, didn't do their job. So it's obvious, what they're there for and what they're amped up for. And these are people who train in, killing situations. They're ready to put out lethal force, at the minute they see something, and we saw some of that lethal force. The idea that they would just be dawdling around while this guy was on the roof is ridiculous. So his explanations don't make any sense. That's further proof of that. Now, a little bit on the back there, just for his background, so I can clarify this. In 1999, Rowe began working for the Secret Service. So he's been there now 25 years. National Security Law Enforcement Policy Advisor in 2011, he supported the National Security Council in formulating the president's counter strategies against state-sponsored economic espionage. Now, and he was doing all this work about trade secrets. He was honored for his appointment as the Presidential Protective Detail, where he served while stationed in New York City as part of the Secret Service September 11th attacks response. It would seem to me that that's a direct interface there, because COG was activated during the September 11th attacks. Let's find out. I will be looking further into his background to see how he directly connects into that apparatus. But I think we're seeing again in his background more of this very shadowy agency in the background. Now, as I mentioned, it's been going around about Josh Hawley and all the things he had to say. And he went into great detail writing to the acting director. And at the end of it, he said, "I want to know the nature of your personal involvement in revising, updating, and otherwise changing the Secret Service policies and personnel related to CSD." So, the idea that this director was directly involved now in stripping the security, I think is going to set up quite the clash. And he also says the number of Secret Service agents who've raised concerns about security practices within the Secret Service and are currently facing disciplinary action, as well as the nature of the concerns and the type of disciplinary action, and the breakdown of Secret Service personnel on July 13th by division or unit. So Hawley and his group is leaning into getting the right answers. We're going to see how much stonewalling the Secret Service can do on this. One of the things I mentioned earlier, and this has come up in a few reports, Secret Service does not have recordings of the radio traffic from the Butler, Pennsylvania attempted assassination. That goes directly to the same type of oversights that were taking place as far back as the Kennedy detail. Those are very major, and the suggestion there is that they didn't want somebody knowing what those communications are. Very clearly, the cover-up is on and the whitewash is on overdrive. Now, let's talk a little bit about what they needed next, now that they took all the security away. So, in a normal setup like this, with a deep state operation, what they would need is to call on the team that could pull it off. 1, to have the cover story ready, and 3, to have the Patsy in place that they could use this. So they'd have to study, and they study on a regular basis who they can use for these different types of operations over time for different things. They might have people take the fall for totally different types of things that are not even very politically related. What's interesting is when you get into a political situation and you get around power, and you're talking about presidential authority, the implications are off the charts, and they involve so many people and interests that this whole deep state interface that we've discussed over time has to make a number of adjustments in order to make sure things come off just right. So the idea was we were going to be looking at an assassination, and then they were going to be able to say Crooks was this disgruntled loner and he did it on his own based on that roof, and he just got a lucky shot off before. And the Secret Service, terrible recriminations against us. We'll have to, there's a tear in our beer because we didn't do our job. This kind of Hallmark card version of reality. But there's a lot of weird things about Crooks, first of all. As we mentioned now last week, one of the odd things that comes up about Crooks right away is his actual identity seems in question here. Let me put that this way. There were a series of doppelgangers around the event, 1, who seemed to look exactly like Crooks looked when they shot him. As a matter of fact, when we saw pictures of Crooks dead, it looked very much like someone else, and they identified this other person, and there was a whole runaround about this other person. I won't get into that part so much, but the presence of doppelgangers is crucial. There are doppelgangers present during the Oswald assassination attempt, and there's doppelgangers also at the Sirhan event. And what they do is they create the impression of what's going to happen before it does. In the case of John Hinckley Jr., who very nearly assassinated President Reagan in 1981, only 3 months into his term, with George H.W. Bush, the former CIA director, waiting in the wings, literally on a plane waiting to hear if he was president when he was going to touch down. Well, if you go just a little bit further back, you're going to find there's an incident with Hinckley where he is caught at an airport in 1979 that Jimmy Carter is landing on. Carter's still president, and he has 3 firearms on him, and he's not very far from where Carter is to be. He gets grabbed. They question him. They don't fingerprint him, nothing. They let him go. So instantly in the books there, we have a little something about John Hinckley, was near a president, had all these weapons. So that by the time he's showing up and shooting President Reagan, and they come up with the elaborate story about Jodie Foster and all the rest of it, they already have him. He's already been entered into the books, as it were. And you see it with Oswald. It's particularly interesting because even when Oswald is in Russia, you have people over here acting as Oswald and saying, "Oh, Cuba's so much better, Russia's so much better, America's such a bad place." And there's a whole pattern of people who remember talking to this guy who identified himself as Lee Harvey Oswald and all the rest, when Oswald wasn't even in the country. So it runs very deep with some of the Patsies. In Oswald's case, at the age of 14, there's a whole story of a family who lived next door to him in North Dakota. Now, in the official record, Oswald never lived in North Dakota. But if you dig into that story, they're very reliable people who were like, we lived right next door to Oswald and his mother, and we called him Harvey. And during this whole, kind of playing out of the scenario, one of the things that happens to this Harvey is he freaks out in a library and he demands that the library be carrying Karl Marx. They don't have it. He freaks out and the police grab him, and they take in this Harvey and they have this talking to. So I'm sure that they were going to use that scenario, and then they decided, oh, we don't want to do that. Actually, let's bring him back to New York, where he will stay with his half-brother, John Pick. And if you look at this very interesting period when Oswald is in New York City, and he's living with his half-brother, when his half-brother is giving testimony to the Warren Commission, they'll ask him, what can you tell us about your brother? And he said, well, I'll tell you this. He doesn't even seem to look the same as when I knew him as when he was growing up. So I don't know who this guy is. So the whole crisscross about two Oswalds starts very, very early. And the idea of these patterns that they're building underneath, I think, are quite important. An interesting thing happens with Crooks when you do a little cross-pollination there. One of those very interesting things is he didn't submit a picture for his high school yearbook. That's odd. Then there are other things in relation to him that are also odd, like the house that he lived in seems to be just a front for somebody, because the neighbors don't recall anybody going in and out except for occasional maintenance men, people working the yard and that kind of thing. So the little bit that we have on his family, and I'm sure it's tough on that family for anything that's going on here, but certainly it's unusual the way that this is being set up. And all that we really know in relation to the parents is that they're both therapists, and there's been a few odd meetings of people showing up with cameras and this guy with a standoffish attitude, and supposedly he's Crook's dad. We don't know very much about Crooks, and I think that they are painting this picture and this record. One of the things I'll mention here is there's a BBC report that said Matthew Crook's father called police because he was worried about his son and his whereabouts. And then it said a law enforcement source told the BBC that, and the new partner CBS, it's unclear when the call was made, but it was before the shooting. So here we have the father going on the record and being like, I don't know where my crazy son is, so instantly creating this track record of a phone call. Now, here's what's interesting. The phone call, whoever this father was, he could have been very nervous about where this guy was and what he was doing. And then they say most people who read the story found it odd that a father unaware of where his 20-year-old son was on a Saturday afternoon would think first to call the police. Now, what's interesting is if you go into the news stories after the fact, the police who originally came up with this story through the BBC now deny it and say, we never got a call. There's no trace of a call from Crook's dad. So we have appearing and disappearing facts from the original version of the story that they told us about Thomas Matthew Crooks and his family and what took place on that day. And then those facts now are starting to mold into one particular narrative. And it's interesting because one of the odd things that they mentioned in the beginning reports, and I remember hearing this right off the bat, is that they had a receipt for a Home Depot ladder. Now, this ladder has multiple lives. And we also seem to have multiple versions of Crooks here. So we have Crooks, who supposedly shows up now in a car. Then you have a van with Arizona plates that's linked to him that is supposedly he's going to set off all these explosives in. There's pictures of that from all the news reports. And then finally, you have Crooks showing up on a bike. There's recent footage of him walking into the event with no backpack and no bike. So at first they said, well, he bought this ladder and here's the receipt for it, Home Depot receipt. Then that disappears and they say, well, about a mile from the incident, we have a ladder and a backpack and we think that's his. And then finally, they have a picture of a ladder there, which just seems to be a different ladder that somebody else brought there. So we have this appearing and disappearing ladder situation. Then we have Crooks himself, how he comes in, 3 different vehicles are suddenly involved. That is the hallmark of an operation where they need to adjust the narrative on the run. But some of those early details are going to be hard to take off the record. Okay. More from this. Okay. Washington Post. Actually, this is WPIX, which is a local news story. Yes.
Do you think they purposefully sort of pollute the waters to just get everybody to go, it's too confusing, I can't deal with it? Like, who knows? There'll be a report on it. I'll believe whatever the report is in, a months, 2 months time.
There's obfuscation like that, exactly. However, I will say this, that I also think that things get outside of their control. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, then all hell breaks loose, because then they need to roll in those phony facts or get rid of them. And that's exactly, this is what you see happening. Yeah. Okay. So ABC News reporting, Trump gunman Thomas Crooks used bike to scout rally unimpeded. This is the original. Would-be Trump assassin Thomas Matthew Crooks rode his bicycle around the former president's rally in Butler and ditched it in full view of the cops and a crowd before he climbed up on top of the roof and opened fire. Law enforcement sources and witnesses confirmed to the Washington Post. Exclusive photos showed the gunman's bike parked beneath a tree just yards from the building, where he fired up to 8 shots, grazing Trump's ear and killing a hero firefighter and wounding 2 other supporters. Now, the Washington Post is finally, grudgingly saying, well, he grazed Trump's ear. Before they were just like, oh, there was some shooting at a Trump rally. We don't know. For a long time, they wanted to keep that up. A witness first noticed the bike at 5:30 p.m. when Crooks was busy scoping out the perfect spot for more than 30 minutes before he fired gunshots. Crooks rode a bike through the Trump rally, law enforcement sources said. Now, bike story is also, like the latter story, has multiple versions, and there's multiple people involved. That's the bike itself. This is supposed to be Crooks' bike. Now, there's an interview that someone else gives where they have this bike and they talk about how they had the bike and they were taking the bike from Pennsylvania to Boise. And the person in question was very unusual in the interview and was saying kind of very sketchy things and just seemed off in general. But that should be the end of the bike story. But the bike story is right in the heart of all this. But here's this other guy who said, no, that's my bike. So now we're in weird territory with Crooks. We have the fact that, there are multiple stories about how he got there, 3 different types of vehicles. Supposedly he had a backpack. How did he get the rifle up there? Well, they asked that point blank to the Secret Service director today. And you know what his answer was? I don't know. 3 weeks later, you don't know how he got the rifle up there. At least in the Oswald story, they had some phony story about him dragging it in and pretending it was curtains. Okay. Wall Street Journal. The gunman who tried to kill Donald Trump was able to fly a drone and get aerial footage of the Western Pennsylvania fairgrounds shortly before the former president was set to speak there. Law enforcement officials briefed on the matter said further underscoring the stunning security lapses ahead of Trump's near assassination. Now, contrast that with the phony Secret Service director today saying, "Oh no, we didn't get to fly a drone, but from now on, we're going to have high-tech drones. Don't you worry about it. You're going to be safe, America, and so will your presidential candidates." It's absurd.
How cheap are the
Yeah,
drones
right.
to begin with?
There's no doubt about it. Any photographer, knows how easy it is to get a drone. Now, let me tell you something. The idea that they failed to get a drone over this site on the Secret Service side, but Crooks, 20-year-old Crooks, is flying a. I mean, you have two absurdities there. One of the absurdities is that the Secret Service didn't do it. Second is that this guy is doing it and they don't notice him or stop him. He's just, hey, I'm going over the site with a drone, has that footage, feeds back that footage to somebody. The other thing that's interesting about Crooks, and you can spot the patterns of deep involvement of other people, the enabling that's involved, getting him on the roof, ladders, vehicles, weapons. This whole thing is not the operation of a single person. There's no way. And they know that. So this is what's so disturbing. Of course, from the earliest stories, the van with the explosives in it after the bomb squad took it on, and there it is being pulled away. Law enforcement got that story out before the Secret Service could say anything about it. The van had Arizona plates. What was that all about? You had some weird things deflecting around on the internet that were sort of grabbing people's last names and showing up in Arizona and, doing weird connect the dots stuff. And I think that is also meant to obfuscate the story as well. So you're going to see things that are paper tigers and false trial balloons of what took place. Obviously, though, the law enforcement aspect of seeing the car that he was driving, the fact that they identified him on this bike, which isn't his bike, it's somebody else's, so that wasn't him that they were seeing. And, and then there's this whole thing about the van, and the van has plates that are from a different state. So these are all very, very confusing pieces. Now, let's go a little bit deeper by looking at patterns here. I want to point this out. Right after the shooting attempt, Trump joins call for RFK to get Secret Service protection. Secret Service has been in the news a lot this year. This is the strangeness that's going on here. And part of it was they didn't want to give it to Bobby Kennedy, which is weird because although he wasn't a serious threat for the nomination or as an independent, he wasn't a serious threat numbers-wise. He had enough of a backing to get Secret Service. And there's no question about that. And given his family's history, you'd think that they would do that automatically. They've done it for all kinds of candidates far, far before any voting takes place. But they intentionally left it off for him. And then Trump made a big issue of it right after his own assassination. And Mayorkas had to, at that point, go ahead and grant him Secret Service protection. How late in the game, in mid-July, before an election, getting Secret Service protection? That's weird, too. And it's indications that Mayorkas was doing the blocking because he was the one who was in charge of putting it out there, just like he was the one who gave them the thumbs up to do it finally. So Mayorkas is showing up as very deeply connected to this labyrinth as we go forward. And we need to take a deep look at him as well. So that's what we're going to do. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is an X-Series special report, the Patsy Profile, Assassination Deep Events, coming in across time right up to the present as they're using the same template here and the same formula of obfuscation across the board through this very same agency, the Secret Service, which, as we know, in the events of November 22nd, 1963, were involved in security stripping the president's motorcade, opening him up to an ambush. And based on all the research at the behest of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, we're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I have some patterns with the Patsies I want to get into, but before I go any further, Yara.
I don't even know what to throw in here.
Go for it.
Food Provider says some agencies failed to protect Trump, others failed to kill him. Heads roll all around.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Excellent point.
Also, I want to throw this in.
Yeah.
Get Smart says, with JFK, there was a Chicago plot, a Miami plot, and a Dallas plot. President Trump's team cannot take any risks whatsoever. And also, DJ, what about foreknowledge? CNN, Fox turning up at the rally, short selling of Rumble stock, etc.
There is foreknowledge involved in these events, of course.
They can't help themselves. They want to make money off of everything.
Well, if you go back, it's interesting. I have a quote. I want to read this. This is something that was a big tip-off for Professor Scott around this case. And it's interesting because when I dug deep into this, I found all the information about D.H. Byrd and Antarctica and Admiral Byrd in connection with the Texas School Book Depository. This is an interview that Professor Scott gave in the 90s talking about how he got into this. And he said, in an original version of a manuscript that he wrote about the assassination, goes back to 1973, and it brought it back to the defense industries, including an electronics firm. This is an aerospace firm, actually, that first got the Vietnam contract in January of 1964. They were doing helicopters, but they had experimental space vehicles, and that is Ling Temco Vought LTV. What's interesting is the owner of LTV bought $2.5 million worth of shares in his own company just before the assassination. Thanks to Lyndon Johnson, their value had escalated to $50 million by the end of 1965, back then. So you got 2.5 million into 50 million just for this one person who's participating. He had done this in partnership with the co-owner of the Texas School Book Depository, D.H. Byrd. So between the two of them there, the more I dug into D.H. Byrd, it was quite interesting because not only is LTV at the heart and the center of this very strange technology espionage that's going on during the Kennedy administration, but also D.H. Byrd happened to be the person who started the Civil Air Patrol, and they had groomed a very young 15-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. So they had these things in place, and they operate in a fashion that, a lot of people would just point to the government and say, well, the government did this or the government did that. What you have to do is watch for the interface between the government and this thing that's operating, which is neither government nor corporate, but operates in this shadowy corridor. And the corridor I've identified is right between the intelligence world and the aerospace world. That's where you find these figures over and over again. And that gets into the various patsies as well, because I found aerospace connections over and over again when dealing with them. Of course, Oswald and Guy Bannister, and Oswald's flirtation with working for NASA and telling everyone that's where he was going when he went to Texas to get this job at the Texas School Book Depository. Sirhan Sirhan, this is quite fascinating because Sirhan was he was somebody who was really easily hypnotizable. Now, this is interesting. He was a perfect subject because a hypnotist later, once he was in custody, said, and he was one of the top guys. He was from Columbia University. He said, "I've never seen somebody more pliable in the hypnotic state." So he was a classic case of MK Ultra, and of course, one of the top people, William Bryan, who was the grandson of William Jennings Bryan, bragged before his own death about having hypnotized Sirhan, setting him up to do the shooting. And it's interesting, of course, we know that Sirhan wasn't the one who actually killed Bobby Kennedy. It was the person who was behind him. And in this case, the person behind him who had a weapon was the security guard who'd only been hired 3 days earlier. And that was Thane Eugene Caesar, who fled to the Philippines after all this. But interestingly enough, if you just go a little bit, if you go even a little bit into his history, and this is something we put in the UFO File Assassins documentary, he worked at Skunk Works. So he's at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, which is the most secret division, and that's the division that deals with advanced UFO work. And it's interesting because this position that he's in there, he's 24 years old. He gets this incredibly posh assignment with them, and then out of the blue, he shows up 3 days before Kennedy is to be at the ambassador, and he's the one who ushers him in and all the rest of it. I had a conversation with RFK Jr. about Thane Eugene Caesar, and he was working with him a couple of years ago on the phone to have him confess, basically. And Caesar was trying to negotiate the terms of how he would do this. So he was going to confess, and he died along the way. He was getting a little older, but he wasn't that old. And
what did he die of? Do you remember?
It's natural causes according to his family. Yeah. But I found the whole thing very interesting. But you can see this overlap of the aerospace agencies, and the fact that they are ignored in the swath of research that's done around assassinations is a great mystery to me, because I see their footprints all around it, including the LTV part that Professor Scott brought out. If you go into LTV, you're going to find, they did helicopters, but they're kind of the central core of their thing was developing early experimental satellites. Now, let's get into a couple of things. There's a video now that's been shown on Fox News and others. I do want to point this out. And again, I'm going to put together a video presentation of this whole thing, but I just want to get us onto this. This is how obvious the shooter's position was. And if you can imagine a security division missing this guy up here in the corner, just sitting, hanging over the event, getting ready to shoot President Trump. I mean, it's just beyond absurd for the Secret Service to go forward there and say they don't know how this happened. And there's a deeper close-up of Crooks on the roof about to shoot. Now, I say Crooks. I'm not convinced that it was Crooks who was up there doing the shooting. And this is where things get interesting as well. But my own analysis of it is that there were 3 shooters that were involved, and that whatever they were doing with Crooks was to have him be the patsy for it, to make it appear as if he's doing this shooting. But I don't think that they would have trusted the assassination attempt to Crooks. What they do have, this one was particularly interesting. I thought it was something that he put up. Thomas Crooks, computer technology. Hello, my name is Thomas Crooks. I'm currently in 11th grade at Bethel Park High School. I've always had an interest in building things. In 2017, my dad and I built our first PCs, a gaming machine with a Z170 motherboard and Radeon R9 graphics card. We later modified the case to include a glass side panel and RGB lighting. My interests are highly varied and include computer technology, engineering, history, and economics. I plan to go to college locally after I graduate. He was going to go to Robert Morris University, which is in Moon, Pennsylvania. And of course, we've done quite a bit about Moon. That was an interesting coincidence, but this shot really, if you take a look at this person, the idea that he was conceiving on his own to move forward to take out President Trump, and that he defied the Secret Service and all these other things, the story doesn't hold together at all. Crooks was dropped into the middle of all this and set up as a patsy and ultimately sacrificed. That's the fact on the ground. And I think the sooner that we get to this, and the sooner that we get to the analysis of how they used the patsy with this, it's important to note that the doppelganger idea is so thick that you find even people in the crowd who seem to be lookalikes of crooks. The guy on the roof, and I showed pictures of that last week. They had a picture from the Fox footage that this viewer submitted to them that was at the event. This guy that's up there on the roof, he doesn't look like the same person. And the person that they showed dead doesn't look like the same person that they have lying there. Now, there are a lot of variations, of course, in video and photo work and all the rest, but he was misidentified as somebody else, as we know. And that person, Matthew Yerrick, he's fallen off the radar completely. He's just gone. They're not even mentioning him. But he was the one that they first suspected, as this Antifa guy, but he was the person that was involved. He could have just had the curse of looking like Crooks, but for me, he's intentionally placed there. Let's get real. And last week I did a whole thing about Billy Lovelady, and it's an important crossover, which is when these things are done. In the event of Oswald, they had so many lookalikes that it was a confusing situation about who he was. But there's something in intelligence work called a legend, and a legend is something where somebody needs to show up in certain different places to create this background and this whole thing, and they use 4 or 5 people to create the legend. Unfortunately, it looks to me with Crooks that they had sized him up as a very kind of weak personality, easily led, and that he appears to me to be programmed to be in the position that he's in. It's also, I got to tell you, it's mystifying, the scene of his assassination. The scene of him on that roof being shot is also odd, because when they've had the overhead of what took place there, you would expect to see a lot more carnage from it. And what you have is a straight line of blood dripping down. The whole thing looks bizarre, of course. We've also had stories about people showing up immediately and saying, take all these pictures and send them to me on this phone. And, the identity of these people, are they from ATF? Are they from the bomb squad? There's some identifications there that are not very clear, but something is unusual at the scene immediately. And I think that is very apparent. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a special report, the Patsy profile. We're doing a tight report tonight. We're going to go about 15 more minutes with you. We're going to jump in with questions in just a minute. And I want to remind you, of course, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That keeps us in touch, and it's a weekly newsletter. It's free, and it lets you know about all the exciting shows we have coming up, documentaries. We just announced that 6-part documentary, Berkner's Secret, and that's going to get into some deep, deep territory relating to the UFO file and advanced technology, not to be missed. And we will give subscribers access to that first. We also have some incredible guests, X-series shows, and live events that will be coming up that we're going to announce here. It's all in that newsletter. So you have to stand up and be counted and make sure you're on the newsletter. And while you're there, subscribe to the site. What do you got there, Miss Olivia?
I got a few. Quantum Paradox says, Crooks is MK Ultra for sure. You look at his eyes and you know something has gone wrong. Joseph Tuga says, so I wonder if Crooks ever read Catcher in the Rye. I'm Not Dead Yet says, both parents psychologists? Could they be agents themselves? Could they be the ones who hypnotized their own son? Tessa 1111 says, have his parents been tested for DNA to show any connection to Crooks? And Golden Girl says, where is the body and who is the coroner? There are so many questions that we need answers to. Wouldn't it be nice if we trusted somebody in government to give us those answers?
Yeah, it's incredible. There's so many loose ends with this. I will say this, there's something unusual with the way that they're presenting his background. And, I never, ever jump ahead and attribute to people like the parents or anything like that, any particular pernicious motive or anything like that. I'm always careful to see exactly what we hear about. I do think it's interesting that when you talk about psychology and psychiatry around this, and then the unusual behavior of the person as the patsy, then you see that there's some interface immediately of the terminology of this being around him. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with his actual parents at all. And I don't think we can ascribe any, um, kind of evil intentions to these people until you know something. A lot of the people, like Oswald's family, they're dropped into a situation, and you need to kind of sort out what's being done to them. That's the interesting thing. So it's to be very, very careful uh, in terms of where we, kind of make conclusions about
I don't
things.
know. The house is such a red flag.
Well, see, this is the thing. Were the parents even in that house? Um,
How do we know it is their house?
well, this is interesting. No, they checked that out. The house, though, seemed to be it was worth about $250,000, which is unusual. You would think in the kind of bracket that they were in, as kind of high-powered professionals. This is unusual. What I found interesting, and it came up during the questioning of Colonel Paris, which was that they mentioned just that the place itself, when the authorities got there, was spotless. And it, basically had this immaculate, almost,
Like sterile.
lab
Mhm.
sterile environment. So when we think about this, you know, um, we've heard unusual things like this before. And I have to say that even things like the Batman shooter came to mind when I was going through a lot of the reports on this. There's a lot of different threads of how they put these people out there. It's not to say that the actual incidents don't take place or that the actual people aren't involved all the time. It's that in very specific situations, it's very convenient for them to set up in advance an intelligence operation by a special ops group that goes in there, and they have their patsy ready, and they have the incident ready, and they have the explanations ready. And then it's incumbent on the investigator side to look at it and say, what is it that is outside of their perfect planning? And this happened a lot in the various cases over the years that have opened up all of those cases so that we understand the official stories around, the classic patsies like Oswald and Sirhan, um, and Hinckley and others aren't real. These aren't the real stories. These were cover stories that were put out intentionally by the deep state. We have to automatically look at this and say, they intended to have Trump dead, and then they wanted this after story of this disgruntled patsy. What they have instead is that Trump is still alive, and they've kind of set off this mechanism where the Secret Service is on the run doing all the defense. But the whistleblowers that are coming to Hawley, I think, is a crack in the whole structure. So we're also looking there. Remember when the FBI were shouting off Hawley and making sure that he didn't show when he showed up to the scene, they didn't want him there. The weird power washing the FBI was doing, that is definitely getting rid of evidence. So, the elected branch of the government is at odds right now with the establishment overlay, and the establishment overlay is honeycombed with corruption. So we're getting into very, very tricky territory.
Kate says there was no trash or even silverware in the home.
Whoa.
Very odd.
Think about that. And yeah, we saw, well, there are those odd things of when the family shows back up, they have all this luggage that they're moving into the house as if they're going to make it look lived in now. I don't know. It's that they make it very, very. There's going to be more for sure coming out about that, but we're in very tricky territory. I want to take us into another Patsy and cross-reference it again with Crooks, and then we'll take your questions. How's that? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going about another 20 minutes with you here. Let's talk about John Hinckley Jr., who was released recently, and There's so many unusual things about John Hinckley Jr. One thing I want to say right off the bat is there's an incredible crisscross with him and the person who shot John Lennon, Mark David Chapman. The crisscross between the two is actually quite dramatic. But what's interesting is that Hinckley Jr. has right off the bat this incredible Bush connection, and that it was originally reported right off the bat by even traditional sources. Hinckley is a classic case in this sense, and the Hinckley family were, on the record, very close to the Bush family. So this guy was basically put in place to eliminate Reagan, because Reagan, even though he had, some deep state people in his cabinet, is somebody who went into the job with a lot of natural ideals. And a lot of those ideals were less government, gold is money, strong defense, all these types of things, rebuilding America. And the people who tagged Bush into his VP slot, he didn't like Bush. This is the interesting thing. Not a lot of people know that. When they ran against each other, Bush referred to his work as voodoo economics. And Reagan didn't have any patience for Bush. And what happened was Reagan had taken Ford on if Ford had been president. So Ford was in a VP slot, and Ford gave kind of a weird, stumbling, very, very odd presentation about how he was going to be like a co-president. And Reagan got out of that situation and got a visit from David Rockefeller. After that, Bush got onto the ticket, and there was some deal struck in the background that will support you all the way. Just need this guy on your VP side. Now, Bush is so deep on the CIA side, and we've done a number of shows relating to Bush 1, and his father, of course, who was the senator who was deeply involved with the Nazis. Bush, I want to say this about Bush, had been involved with the CIA as far back as the 1950s. So we need to kind of keep that in mind when we look at the Bushes and the things that they were involved in. Bush very famously said, when asked, that he didn't remember where he was during the Kennedy assassination. Of course, everyone did. It's just an odd thing for him not to remember. Of course, he remembered. Now, some news stories from the original piece. This comes out of the Texas News Herald. Hinckley's brother had ties with the Bush family. It was well known and widely reported, and then quashed. That shooting as well was not the work of a lone gunman at all. And as a matter of fact, not only did he strike President Reagan and almost kill him, he came within an inch of landing the bullet in his heart. That would have been the end of President Reagan only a couple months into his term. And you would have had Bush for that whole arc of the 1980s. There were a lot of deep state positioning getting us into the 80s. There was a season of assassination that took place there when you look back at it. And there were assassinations of the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat. There was the attempted assassination of the Pope. And there was the assassination of John Lennon, which has an incredible parallel with the assassination attempt on Reagan. I'm going to show you how that works. So Scott Hinckley, the brother of the man charged with shooting President Reagan, and 3 others, was to have dined tonight in Denver at the home of Neil Bush, the son of Vice President George Bush. The Houston Post has reported on a copyright story. There's no denying it. The Hinkleys and the Bushes were incredibly tight. They were both out of Texas. This branch of the Hinckley family lived in Colorado, but they were all oil millionaires. And so basically they were ready to do this, and they had decided somehow to use their own son in the process. And they had filled up this whole kind of background. Oh, he has depressive issues and all these types of things. And as I said, he was a wanderer. He would go cross country and do these different things. And in one of those cross country runs, he gets picked up in the airport in Tennessee with 3 firearms very close to where President Carter is. And this is only a year before he shoots Reagan.
And then they just let him go.
No, what's interesting? Yes, they just let him go, and there's no fingerprints.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's quite remarkable. There's a number of news stories from the period. Bush's son was to dine tonight with shooting suspect's brother. Bush's son was to dine with suspect's brother. It's just undeniable piece. Now, Bush himself, very suspiciously, was close to George de Mohrenschildt. De Mohrenschildt was the oil geologist who was the CIA caretaker for Lee Harvey Oswald on the record. And the Warren Commission even used his testimony to sink Oswald as the lone nut. But de Mohrenschildt, we know, eventually became very nervous about this and thought they had duped him into participating in it. And then he decided, I'm going to actually talk about this because there were all these hearings in the 70s bringing the Kennedy assassination back to the surface. And so he writes to George Bush. And the only reason that thing didn't get burned was because where it came through when he was the director of the CIA, a number of people had seen the letter coming in. So the people who were sorting the mail for him, his secretaries, etc. So he had to kind of say something about it. He couldn't just burn it and get rid of it. So, but the letter, which I've pointed out before, said, you know, you need to help me out. I'm being basically tracked here, and there are all these people after me. I think it's because I tried to write stupidly about Oswald, and you need to remove this gauntlet around me. And this is just before de Mohrenschildt shows up dead. De Mohrenschildt's one of the most mysterious characters in the heart of setting up Oswald. And, you know, this is somebody who is established on one side to be friends with the Bush family, but also friend with the Bouviers. So, you know, just an incredible interface sitting right in the middle of the intrigues. That's a picture of Bush on the plane waiting to hear that Reagan's been shot and killed so he can take over as president. And I found some of the scrawlings that he was making on the plane there, and some of it is
Whoa.
like, you know, some of the
It's an
weird
anxious
scrawlings.
little doodles.
They're like, oh, you know, the destiny that awaits me, and all this weirdness there, and like prayers for a good man, you know. So Bush had intended to do this. Now, what's interesting is the person who often gets brought up in relation to this is Alexander Haig, who was the Secretary of State at the time, because he said, I'm in control as soon as he heard Reagan was shot. But it's interesting because at that point in America, you had the president shot and then you had the vice president in the air. So the idea was Reagan was to die, and then, you know, Bush would come off the plane and be like, this is a tough time for America, just like LBJ did 20 years earlier. So the pattern of assassination and how they've used it is interesting. If you go back to Kennedy's period, again, they assassinated just 3 weeks before President Kennedy. The DM brothers who were running Vietnam, they had assassinated the UN director, and there were a series of assassinations and attempted assassinations, like President de Gaulle in France. So you had a whole reshaping of the board, and that's just how this group operates. So what they're doing now, just like you see when we talked about the season of assassination, is there have been a number of heads of state that have been taken out this year. And Trump was to be part of that because they know that he's in a position where he's on a trajectory to reclaim the presidency again, and they can't have that. So this is the nature of the problem that they're facing. Yeah, what do you got?
David Termina says there's a video of Reagan condemning Bush as a member of a secret society and wanting nothing to do with him just before accepting him as VP. That video has been completely scrubbed.
Oh, that is interesting. He did say some very choice things. Their early debates are so hostile that they hate each other. And yet here they are now. Of course, Jeb is there along with W and Reagan and W's dad. I mean, Reagan is surrounded there. And, you know, it gives you quite a hint because they used Reagan. He was the magic carpet to get them into the White House because they weren't very good at politics. Here's the weird thing about George Bush, which is he ran for Senate and Congress in Texas and lost both. So, he was a congressman for 2 years in Texas, but not very convincing on the voting side. So they needed the charisma and the whole, kind of spotlight that Reagan provided. Now, I want to mention Mark David Chapman here because it's important in that what they were doing and how we look at the field of assassinations that needs to take place when they're doing psyops on this level. They need to complete the programs in a period of time. And what's disturbing about this year is that they're resorting to tactics that they've used in different periods in history to change the balance of history. And they're going back to very traditional CIA assassination team techniques. What's interesting is when you get into the case of John Lennon, you'd have to say, well, how does he figure in, as a figure? He wasn't a political representative. Well, he had such a political background and he was such a force politically that back in the early 70s, he'd been deemed by the Nixon administration as a kind of an enemy alien, and they spent all this time trying to deport him. So much so that by 1976, he had retired from music and was fighting all of these various lawsuits to get him out of the country. And he went off the radar, and then he was able to stay in the country and sort of keep a low profile. But he announced he was coming back. And all the things that they had planned, like the nuclear buildup, the Central American wars, etc., Lennon would have been the kind of guy who they would have suspected immediately he's going to be a problem. And Lennon was also very outspoken politically to a point that they were looking at him and saying, well, we have an old score to settle with him as well, which is, we wanted to get rid of him the first time. He's also in an unusual position of being able to attract, and really set off a really large scale movement. Now, what happens with Lennon is interesting because when he resurfaces, all of these things in the Patsy's life start to go off the rails. So I want to say this about Mark David Chapman. It's not brought up very often, but he's part of this World Division church, which Hinckley is also a part of. And Hinckley's family runs the church. So you have to think of why these oil people would be running this worldwide church.
Money laundering?
Well, it's interesting.
Spy movement?
Yes, all kinds of different things. Now, what they do with Hinckley is one thing, but what they do with Chapman is very interesting, which is they ship him over to Lebanon, actually Beirut, which is the assassination capital of the world in terms of training at the time. And no American can just go in there, literally. You think about a place like North Korea or something now. This is a war zone, one, and you need to be directly guided by American authorities. You can't get in and out of there and just casually go about. If you look at the trajectory of Mark David Chapman, it's very, very unusual. And by the time he lands in New York City, he is an out-of-work security guard coming from Hawaii who should have no money. But he's staying in, a great hotel. He's, I mentioned this, he actually was ordering these escort prostitutes on a nightly basis while he's there waiting for Lennon. And I've also put forward the unusual art collection that he had for someone who was supposed to be working security at a hospital. This guy had original Dali paintings and things of this nature, Dali prints, and they don't add up for someone of his financial stature. So this is possibly how they were paying him. When he's caught, of course, all the programming activity, the Catcher in the Rye book, all these different things. And if you track him a little bit later during his incarceration, you're going to find him hypnotizing his fellow cellmates. And so much so that there are complaints that he is basically mind controlling them. So, there are telltale signs all over the place that he was controlled from an MK Ultra perspective and that he learned those very same controls. Now, his activity while he's in New York City is very erratic as well, including the fact that the day before he does the assassination, he bumps into James Taylor, the singer, and he's in the street and he sees him and he flips out. He starts to actually have something that looks like a fit, almost like an epileptic fit on the spot. And James Taylor was trying to figure out what was going on with this person, but it's almost like the programming was kicking in, but he was seeing the wrong celebrity. That's the way that I looked at it. He was meant to do this thing and he's seeing this other celebrity.
Wow.
Now, check this out. I'm going to do a little arc here with Chapman. Chapman is waiting outside of the Dakota for John Lennon to sign his album. He gets Lennon to sign his album, and there's a photographer there who captures the moment. And the photographer is somebody who was kind of a groupie of John Lennon. It just so happens that he's there, but boy, wasn't that some luck. And so Lennon signs the album for him. This is before, just before Chapman is going to shoot him later. Chapman is standing outside the Dakota and he gets this moment with Lennon, and then Lennon signs it, hands it to him, and says, "Is that all right?" And there's a shot of Lennon looking at him and wondering, why is he just standing there not saying anything? That's the shot that they usually leave out. But I found that interesting because it seems like Lennon knows something is going on. What will happen is Chapman will wait there and then shoot John Lennon, and he will shoot him with such skill that it becomes a very strange story also what took place there, including the fact that the security guard seems to come out later and hasn't called the police, which is very unusual. The security guard also has a very interesting background in that he was part of the original Bay of Pigs landing crew, working the door of the Dakota. And there's a lot of unusual things about the shooting of Lennon as well, as if it wasn't pulled off by Chapman. But Chapman and his activities worldwide sounded very much like the activities of Hinckley. And, you know, it's interesting. If you look at Lee Harvey Oswald, Oswald's in Russia, he's in Finland, forget it. This guy's everywhere. And, you know, he is in Asia with the Marine Corps. He's in Japan. There seems to be a pattern that they move these people through this kind of world government piece. They're global and their operations are global. So the things that they do here operate on one level, and then the assassination training takes place in a number of different places.
Timothy Gessing is bringing up John Hinckley Sr.'s involvement with World Vision and its relationship to the parallax view.
Yes. Well, that's the exact thing that I mentioned there, which is that this is the same organization that Chapman is associated with. Parallax View is a 70s movie by Sidney Pollack, 75, and it follows the assassinations of the Kennedys. And the character involved is a news reporter who figures out that it's a corporation, kind of Expertech corporation, that's doing the assassinations on behalf of the government. And sometimes it will do the assassinations even over the government's objections. And the training of the mind-controlled assassin is very interesting because what takes place is, you know, they need to ingratiate themselves. And Warren Beatty, who's playing the character, goes kind of undercover, and he's going to figure out exactly how they do this. And he's playing a violent type, and they develop this kind of kinship with him. And they say, you know, you're a very special person. And the fact that the world doesn't respect you, you know, it just makes you more special. It's because you're so different. But here we have a place for you. You know, you're just the kind of person that we need. And it's quite remarkable. I always recommend the Parallax View because they captured it. They caught the moment there. They understood that larger piece, very much like 3 Days of the Condor. I think that one does
It's actually
well.
Alan J. Pakula.
Oh, is it Pakula? Yeah,
Mhm.
Pollock does Clute.
No, that's
Pakula too.
He's one of my favorites.
Pollock, though, he does one of the major ones. I always mix those two up. But Pakula is, forget it. He's one of the greatest.
Does 3 Days of the Condor.
Yes, right.
which is
That's
great.
his. So they're both on that level. And in the 70s, somehow there's that great understanding. But you had people in the 70s like Mae Brussel and others, and there's a weird crossover with Hinckley and Mae Brussel. And this is weird because, of course, she in the 70s came to such prominence, and John Lennon actually backed her. John and Yoko went there and kind of supported her. And she was talking all about the Kennedy assassination. She was this remarkable savant about all of it, but she also was aware of the Nazi influence in the background around all of this and the kind of post-war Nazi piece. And you'll find in Dr. Farrell's work, he says a lot about Mae Brussels' influence on him. It's interesting because she's the one who puts these things together, but there's an unusual story about her and Hinckley that I find absolutely fascinating, which is that she reports to the police 3 weeks before Hinckley assassinates Reagan that there's a guy sitting outside of her house who is in this car just running the gas, and he's hanging out there kind of all night. And she has seen him, for a couple of nights doing this. And she's looked at him and she's even asked him, what are you doing out here? And he looked very drugged out and his eyes were strange. She said that it was Hinckley who was outside of her house.
I never heard this story.
Yeah. And this is very interesting because
Were they
she,
gonna have
she
to
goes
kill
into
her?
she goes into great detail. It's interesting to me because Hinckley is, just the kind of person that she'd be covering in her research. And her address was very easy to get. As a matter of fact, she even gave it out on air, which was ridiculous. And he shows up and he's just running his gas outside of her house. Think about, some of the strangeness with Hinckley. That's another one of those weird stories with him. But there are so many weird stories with him, including the fact that even today, his associations, he's been let out, of course, but his different associations that the FBI found out about him through organizations, different figures, and his financial backing have all been kept classified. You still don't know about John Hinckley Jr., which is absurd. And Hinckley Jr., is out there. He even puts his music up on YouTube now. They had a whole controversy a year ago where he was going to give a concert in New York City, and then suddenly they canceled it. It's a very unusual thing to have a kind of a rehabbed MK Ultra guy walking
Oh
around
my
out there.
God.
I mean, think about it. So I will say this, that all of the research into the Secret Service and the congressional hearings that they're doing, what they should be doing is some of those patsies, like Hinckley, like Chapman, they're still alive. And you could literally bring them in under testimony or have doctors examine them or hypnotize them to see where the programming is. I'm sure it's still in there. There's a lot of people that could be brought in and put under oath in relation to these things. There's no question in my mind that, there's a famous interview where W. Bush, the president, they ask him point blank about Hinckley. Now, this is in 1987, before Bush is a political anything. And they say, did you know Hinckley? Because he knew, like he basically, he knew your uncle and he knew your dad. And he said, well, it's possible. It's possible. I may have met him, through somebody, but I don't remember him. And he said, it's possible. Maybe he volunteered on my staff. Like, this is the guy who tried to basically put his father into office by taking him out, or he's the patsy who was standing there in it. These people, this group that operates on that deep state level, they're there. They're kind of trackable in that sense. Some of those cases, now that the Hinckley incident took place 40 years ago, as did the Lennon shooting, but those people are still alive. So certainly, I think that there's a possibility to find out more in relation to the techniques that were used and the activities of the intelligence agencies that set those people up. And I think it should be part of the conversation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the Patsy Profile Special Report, Assassination Deep Events. We're going into deep territory here tonight. We're just going to take a few of your questions here before we wrap up. And I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch through the remarkable censorship we're experiencing regularly. Like I said, it was kind of ridiculous when they were showing this thing. They were saying, "Hey, look, Trump's getting censored. If you fill in the thing, in the Google search, you're going to get, it doesn't even complete Trump when you're typing TRUM, And that just made me think of the kind of censorship. So I have an example of that censorship for you. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Check this out. You search in YouTube for Dark Journalist. And yeah, you get the Dark Journalist channel on the top, but look what you get for videos. It's Kamala Harris, baby. And not only that, it's not one Kamala Harris video. I got 4 versions of the same exact video under my own search. If you use the hashtag Dark Journalist in YouTube, what are you going to get? It's going to say nothing to see here. There's thousands of videos up there. So this censorship is something that's very familiar territory to us, indeed. And what I will say is that if you sign up for the newsletter, you get around a lot of that. And we're still looking at ways of getting around the kind of censorship that they lay us on. I will tell you, though, the conversations that we have right here and the ideas from are exactly the reasons why they want to keep, these are the types of conversations that they want to keep from happening in the first place, because we get into very deep territory. And I want to say this on the record, that I think a lot of what we were doing in relation to the false CIA push for a UFO threat is part of why the push behind that threat went so cold. I think that once people like Chris Mellon and stuff exposed themselves by going after me online, and there's a story out about the Grush whistleblower and all the things that he said about the UFO file last year, but he's gone completely underground. This story showed up about him suing the sheriff's office for $2.5 million for letting out his medical records. Well, it's interesting to me, because what that says to me is that whatever payoff they were promising him in the background didn't materialize, and that they kind of moved on their operation into whatever else they're planning to launch this fall. But the CIA UFO threat operation, there weren't many people who were tracking it properly. And the things that we were able to do to put it across, and you in the ideas room, there was a ricochet there. Sometimes it takes one lone outpost to do this, but that ripple is felt across, the Great Divide. And what happens very often is, when they're pushing something on that level, if you get the questions out at the right time, it makes it very difficult for it to materialize. But in the case of the UFO threat, make no mistake, they're not going away for good. They've gone really cold, haven't they, with the public push? This is remarkable. This is something to see. Yeah, what do you got?
Okay. Greedy Cat says, do you think the assassination investigation will lead to prosecutions, or will they get away with it? And Robert Ayala says, DJ, if the order of stand down came from, quote, COG, how realistic is it to expect for Trump, if he gets in again, to bring those responsible to justice?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a couple of weird things there. One of them is that the COG part, they might, by the way, during the whole process of going through the Secret Service thing, throw, one of the officials to the lions. It's possible. They got rid of Cheadle. They might get rid of this guy, but I think they need a real fall guy if they were going to do this. Either they get the cover up really strong, or they need a real fall guy. And I think that the persistent questioning and the fact that whistleblowers are coming through to Hawley may provide a crack in the case on that side. And then on the independent research side, we might be able to crack it on the other, because the official version is ridiculous. And the fact that the world's greatest security service couldn't block a 20-year-old with a rifle on a roof is absurd, and we know that they could have. So we're in a weird twilight they've created a schizophrenic situation. Let's see how it plays out. I put on the record about General Gio, who is the Northcom COG commander, that he is somebody who would be in total charge of the United States in the event of an emergency. And he's also the NORAD commander. Now, it's an interesting thing that I found some documents about them trying to rush him through as the commander to replace General Van Herk. Both of them have, interestingly enough, unusual UFO file connections based on the forts and the different bases that they worked in. But it's interesting about him because one of the things the group that was pushing him for in the Select Armed Services Committee is they said, if you don't push him through and Van Herk retires, then a Canadian will take over the role of COG commander. This, I think, is extraordinary and requires real investigation by Congress, because the idea that in an emergency situation, now he's not Canadian, he is in fact American, and so he has assumed the position, but it was raised that a Canadian was going to take over unless he was confirmed. Now, they've never had a Canadian take over before, but there may be a force in that whole kind of deep state apparatus that wants that eventual reality. The fact that that's even a possibility was astonishing to me. I don't think anyone who studied the COG command structure ever thought a Canadian could step in to that role on that official role. Now, we know the people of Canada are fantastic, but the idea of that government stepping over and becoming the emergency commander is just a globalist's wet dream. And that's something which I found in the Select Armed Services Committee hearings from October of 2023 when they were trying to push him through. So I think there's a lot of questions around COG that should be brought up in tandem with the Secret Service investigation. That's what those people need to hear. Famously, I sent a letter last year to Speaker of the House Johnson regarding the Kennedy files in relation to the hidden UFO files, because they were talking like they were going to do something. And as a matter of fact, at one point he said, oh yeah, we're going to have church style committee hearings next year if I'm speaker or whatever. And of course they never had anything even approaching that vaguely. But those are the types of things. If I were to send him a letter now, what I would say is, while you're doing this Secret Service piece, if you have the committee looking into it, find out about the interface between the continuity of government players and the Secret Service, and then you'll have something. You'll have a place to find out where this goes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the Patsy Profile. We're going to take a couple of your questions and then wrap it up tonight. Miss Olivia, it's up to you.
Okay, David Tormina, DJ, do you suspect that the true motive for the assassination attempt was similar to the JFK situation?
Yes, absolutely.
Which is?
They can't have Trump independently making decisions. And that's somebody who, as president, did a lot of things independently. There were enough deep state players around him, don't get me wrong. But, at the end of the day, they couldn't get a war going with Syria. At the end of the day, they couldn't get certain things that they wanted to press through. Now, JFK was a true peace candidate. Trump, for me, is somebody who didn't involve himself in any foreign wars during his term. Here's a couple of things on the record about Trump, whatever else we can say about him. One, he appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court, and they all held up the Second Amendment right, which so many people make a big statement about the Second Amendment, which is absolutely right. Well, if that's the case, then people who like the Second Amendment piece being strong in the government should really praise Trump for that. Second, he made the border incredibly strong. If you see the border activity during Trump's presidency, we know that's one of his hallmarks, as it were. 3, his economy was great. There was terrible financial news today in the markets, which was absurd. And there's no job growth at all, 0, as they're kind of getting rid of the whole stooge of the Stepford Biden show. and they're trying to install this Harris thing, which I find the whole idea of a Harris administration incredibly dangerous to the United States. And I think eventually it would destroy the United States as a union. Um, and I don't think it'll be easy, even with Trump as president. But certainly, Trump has proven himself to be a much better political player than those people. This is the incredible thing when I see the perfect being the enemy of the good. This is a problem because you see this a lot in independent and alternative circles. Them saying, "Oh yeah, I can't go for Trump because of this or that reason," and then they also don't like Bobby, right? So then, what are they going to do? What does that leave? Well, by default, you hand it over to the Democrats. So you can't have that. And although I understand the cynicism around the parties and all the rest of it, you have to get real that basically Trump is the only option in the presidential race to do any who could provide any real change against what they're doing now. And again, it's not saying Trump is perfect, but you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That's very important. I will tell you another thing in relation to this, which is the people from that wing of the independent world who are pushing against Trump and saying, oh, he's connected with Bitcoin and through JD Vance and all this kind of stuff. They are harping on it to such a level, to such a degree that I think it could do damage to his candidacy. And what's their replacement? Their plan is no plan. They don't have any solution. So that by default hands it to the Democrats and Kamala Harris. Is that really what you want to wake up on election day and hear that Kamala Harris is president? Get real. So there's something wrong with that. And also those people don't take the Democrats to task and they don't support Bobby. There's something weird about that whole wave, which is coming in very strong against Trump, trying to use Vance to take Trump down, and whatever you think of Vance, look, Vance is vice president, first of all. That's one. And I don't like those connections around the tech oligarchs either, but you find them throughout these candidates. So do you think the Democrats are going to be better? So we have to kind of be real about all this. When you get into the nitty gritty on it, there's something strange about this thing that's coming in, this narrative that, oh, you can't support Trump because of this or that. And, these same people are also against the Kennedy candidacy. Well, then that leaves Kamala Harris. That's the fact. Those are the realities on the ground. You're going to have Kamala Harris as president. Is that what you want? I certainly hope not. So how does that have anything to do with, kind of independent or alternative research and media? Something weird about it. And for me, I think it's being influenced. And I'm very, very suspicious about the nature of them always calling out the Trump thing on this front and leaving the Democrats with kid gloves. There's something wrong with that. And they're playing into the hands of basically handing this government over to Harris come November 5th. And I think that is a terrible disaster for the United States. And I'll fight against it completely by bringing up the fact that, we need in 2025 to completely change what's been going on in the country. And the first thing is we need to seal the border to make it a real country again. That's just a fact. Yes, Miss Olivia.
This is an interesting question. Oldest Dirt says, President has the power to send House and Senate back home until he calls them back. Does DJ think Trump would do that while cleaning house and making new laws?
I don't know. I mean, I think what you could get with Trump is they'd have an understanding, one, about a strong, first of all, the whole global military thing and him expanding empire. He wouldn't do any of that. That's all the Biden Democrat illness at this point, and the neocons in the Republican Party as well. But Trump is an America firster, so he's not very into that. That's what his record shows. That we've had his presidency. We have some understanding of what he would do. At the same time, I don't see that. I think he would appoint some good people, and he has the experience to do it now. I think it would be good if there was someone in his campaign who was kind of a crusader around this idea of purging the government of the bad actors. I don't see a lot of that with Trump right now. I think he's trying to get in to initiate America First policies. And
he's a deal maker.
For me, that's good enough
Mhm.
for him to get in. I don't think the Trump presidency would be perfect. That's not what I would never suggest that. But I will say you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In this case, it's really, America's teetering on an edge, and you have got to have constitutional rule. When the campaign started, I said, you had Trump who could do it and you had Bobby who could do it. Well, Bobby's campaign has become marginal as we've gotten more down to the wire. There's no question about that. Bobby looks like he's brought forward some good ideas, and his independent party that he's built could be a player in 2028. And I think he should be at the heart of that. But I don't think that he can win in this election. I don't think anybody who's been studying it or studying electoral votes thinks that he can win. I don't think he can win a state at this point, the way that things are. Those are just the facts on the ground. Doesn't mean he's not a great candidate or that he doesn't have great ideas. It's just on the ground, you've got a tremendous battle between the Trump forces and this Harris thing coming out of the, fall of Biden. So that's where the clash is. And if anything, the Bobby part, what I would do in order to give myself credibility for 2028 is I would throw the support to Trump if I were on Bobby's side, for the mere fact that the Democrats can't assume power again and destroy the country, because that's what they're in the process of doing. Look, the trans stuff, the way they've overblown that, not even talking about real trans people, I'm talking about the political insanity that they've been doing here. The whole puberty blockers thing, what they're doing with kids, saying, hey, in California, you don't need your parents to have surgery to change your sex. I mean, come on, so it's an insanity thing. Somewhere you have to stop it. And I think on the Trump side, that's something that he would immediately arrest the expansion of, which is that whole insane trans ideology piece. And that is, again, the political side of it. And he would also immediately cease the border incursions, which is absolutely crucial. You can't have a country survive like this. When Bobby Kennedy went down to the border, he said he saw, just in the short time he was there, about 500 people from various countries. And it's not like they were coming in from Mexico. These were people who were coming from the Middle East and other places that weren't friendly to the United States. It's a recipe for disaster, and they know it. So the number one rule, I think, looking at the election, is seal the border. I don't care who does it, but I know Harris won't do it. So, you have Trump, and then Bobby, I think, talked a good game on it, but Bobby can't get into the White House. He doesn't. He's somewhere in between 5 and 10% in the polls. As things have developed, his candidacy gets more marginal. That's just the fact on the ground. That happens. When people start to get serious about the election, they're like, well, I need to go, Republican or Democrat. Now, if he has that 4-year wing to build up the party, then the independent party possibly could get the majority of votes in 2028, though. You can't do it in 24. And if anything, you can alienate or marginalize yourself as a candidate by staying in too long. That's also a risk, So I think he should throw the support to Trump. At least, they both merge together, and I think he should serve in a Trump cabinet. Yeah.
YouTuber 427, does DJ think the military industrial complex wanted Trump out because he wants to reduce contributions to NATO and the wars?
Oh, they want him out for a number of reasons. Fundamental is that Trump doesn't play on their field. And he's not somebody who's beholden to those powers, coming in as a billionaire. So he comes in representing a very different part of this apparatus of deep control. And the America First, Fortress America piece is a very different group than the world globalist, expansionist empire freaks. And those people are willing to risk, World War III. They want a nuclear exchange. Like they no longer are working from a sane template, and they're not coming from a sane place. The other groups that we've had, even earlier leadership in America, it's not been perfect. by a long shot. Let's face it. But it still has the American ideal at the heart, and so therefore, I think if you have somebody who appreciates the value of America, the value of the Constitution, the value of a conservative Supreme Court, then you have a much better trajectory for the future than this kind of freak show that is largely run by China through the Democrats. So that's just where we are. Now, I don't think any party has the solution. I've never said that. I just think in the current election, you need somebody to stop the kind of hemorrhaging on the border. And it is absolutely crucial and imperative to do that. And if we hand this election over to somebody like Harris, I literally feel like we'll doom the United States. I don't think America can stand 4 more years of that, coming out of the Stepford Biden thing into that. She's one of the worst candidates I've ever seen in my life. Yes.
Bartikoff, do you think that Trump will actually release the JFK files if he's elected this time? And
Yes.
David Tormina says, DJ, do you have suggestions as to who Trump should appoint to Homeland Security if he indeed manages to survive this season of assassination?
Well, he already, there are people around him giving him advice about this, and he's already checking out the loyalists, I would say. I think that Bobby Kennedy should be added as the HHS director, and I think there should be the installation at the head of all these organizations of people that are constitutionally minded. And I don't think that Trump would keep Christopher Wray. This is interesting because he appointed Christopher Wray, but was very disappointed in him. And, it's not a normal thing to just switch out FBI directors, but my impression is that he would go with somebody totally different. I think if any of the organizations that he would shake up would be the FBI because they've been turned so ruthlessly against him. Remember, we have a sentencing coming up with President Trump in September, right after September 11th anniversary, and the shenanigans they could pull in relation to that, we shall see. But the legal people who've been looking at it, like Judge Napolitano and others, they've said there's no way that they would incarcerate President Trump, and also the appellate court and the Supreme Court would overthrow anything that they do. So he anticipates they'll just give him some kind of suspended sentence, and that'll be that. Think about all the incredible legal warfare we've seen going on, even leading up to this. Obviously, the Get Trump campaign merged from a legal attempt, a media attempt to a legal attempt to assassination attempt. There's no question about that. The question is, what's the next move on their part? And my feeling is that they will not let up and that they intend to keep President Trump out. For some reason, a lot of people around the independent world were like, oh, Trump is going to get in, it's going to be terrible because all of these Bitcoin people are with him or whatever. And that's nothing, that is nothing compared to the insanity of the deep state control we have now. Forget about that. What you have is maybe a very small window to change the trajectory of America. And this election is it, in my opinion. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm getting some trolls. I've got to delete for a second here.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap up soon. This has been fantastic. And I have more on the whole Patsy side, so I may do a part 2 of this. Let's keep a couple of things in mind on the Patsy front, and I've pointed this out. This is there's 2 things. There's one thing I wanted to read.
You know what? I want to actually say
hold
something.
on.
Okay.
When I mention, I'm sorry, I better get this out while I remember it, and then I want to take your question.
Sure.
Okay, and then we'll take one more question. Okay. So I mentioned earlier about General Guillot and the fact that they were trying to ram through him as the COG Northcom commander. Now, this is the actual statement, and this comes from it's the Select Armed Services Committee. And here's what they were basically threatening if you don't let this guy through. If U.S. Northcom Commander General Van Herk is forced to retire without a confirmed replacement, as is currently the expectation given the senator's hold, this is October 2023, NORAD and its Homeland Defense mission will be commanded by a Canadian instead of an American. Now, I've never seen a suggestion in government of a Canadian taking over those positions. There it is on the record. So this is something we're going to go deeper into, and this is what I recommend that Senate committee, the House committee looking into, the Secret Service look into. What is that? I have never, ever seen anything saying that under emergency powers, some official from Canada becomes the complete ruler of the United States. I mean, this is insanity. So that is an actual government document direct out of the Select Armed Services Committee. That's something which we're going to follow up on. And of course, a quick thing here in talking about the development of Patsy's. For years, JFK researchers said, including Jim Garrison, this character, David Ferry, who interfaced with the Central Intelligence Agency, did all kinds of mind control stuff, did drug running, and also ran arms to Cuba and everything else, that he had, in the Civil Air Patrol, had been the person who had been the link for Oswald into the intelligence field, and then further had him do covert missions. And that's how Oswald got in the Marines and all the rest. So all the authors and the kind of mainline guys like Gerald Posner said, there's no record that they even knew each other and all that kind of stuff. So it came out in the when they looked at it, the 1955-1956 year of the Civil Air Patrol that Lee Harvey Oswald was in with David Ferry. That was one. And then they found the picture of the two together in the Texas, in the New Orleans branch of the Civil Air Patrol. So when you talk about developing a Patsy, here now is Oswald, he's 15 years old. So yes, can you take a Patsy and develop them at that period, especially around this military apparatus that's obsessed, with mind control? There's no question about it. They built Oswald, and he was a long-term build. One of the people involved in that was the person who owned the Texas School Book Depository, and that's Ryhold Byrd, who was the cousin of Admiral Byrd and the brother of Harry Byrd. So, when you get into this, you're starting to look at forces and the way that they interface. But I don't think it's any accident that somebody who was involved on the level of staging the Kennedy assassination is the same person who started the Civil Air Patrol. Where do they find Oswald anyway? That's a real link, I think. And I want to say this in relation to America. We can talk about it in America. We can really size it up and really figure out where the different strands come from. In a lot of countries, you can't even really talk about it. In a place like Russia, they just eliminate the opposition after all. So it's to America's credit that we can do it. But the problem is, as Americans, we need to see a force like that operating on our own soil is something completely alien to the constitutional nature of the government here. So this is part of it. So it's not so much an indictment of America looking at these things and saying that the deep state has been in control. It's that America has been used by these forces, and it's important to restore America to true constitutional government. And that's really what these types of investigations can do on our side to really understand what's going on. Yes, what were you going to say?
Okay. Well, I'm going to throw that out, but I'm going to throw these in.
Oh, yeah. What do you got?
So Joseph Tuga says that would put us under the British crown again. This is COG. David Termina says that sounds like a British/Mossad plot if ever I heard one. And YouTuber 427 says having Canada step in at NORAD is the beginning of the blurring of the US-Canadian border, which is the actual plan of the globalists.
Well, it's interesting because when they were doing the Chinese balloon bit, and they were like, hey, it's a UFO shoot down, all of that took place. The shoot down part was supposed to take place in Canada and Alaska, as you recall. And then when it got off the coast of Carolina here, South Carolina, then they took it down. But what's interesting is they did a fascinating thing where the headlines that were run at the time were, hey, NORAD shoots down UFO. And when they had the COG commander Van Herk, they said, do you think it's extraterrestrials? And he said, I'm not ruling anything out. That's done on purpose. That's the first public test of the UFO threat and the COG command. There's no question. It is the trial balloon. And as someone who's studied the COG piece for years, I've never seen the possibility that Canada could step in as the COG commander. It's never been raised, but they raised it in that hearing to try to rifle through our friend, General Gio from Fort McDill, Florida, which has a huge UFO stamp. So I found that interesting. The mere mention that it could even be a legal enterprise to do such a thing is beyond fathom.
News Drifter says Senator Mark Kelly started a company that sails high altitude balloons and takes Chinese funding.
He does. And this is interesting because there's a couple of weird things about him. Of course, he is directly, he's a kind of a symbol of that aerospace NASA piece, but he's being raised strongly as a VP possibility. Oh. Which I find very strange, yeah. But he's also, remember, associated with the whole Gabby Giffords shooting. There's a lot of weird things because he's right directly, I mean, that's his whole family situation in a nutshell. He's right in the heart of it. So I think there's a lot of weird things with just raising him. And also the fact that if you're raising the governor of Pennsylvania, where, there was the Trump assassination took place, there's some rumor that Trump's going to go back to Butler. I certainly hope that's not the case. It would be his style. I don't recommend it, Trump. Let me tell you, I wouldn't go there if I were you. Once is enough. And, I'm sure that the people are wonderful in Butler. I'm speaking strictly from a political point of view. And I think it's highly unwise, because I wouldn't give him the chance to finish the job. And with that, Miss Olivia, we'll take your last question.
All right. This is the last question, but I'm going to open it up to a greater question. Wally Tango Foxtrot said, had the Trump attack been successful, the shooter's identity would have likely been that other doppelganger and the planned Antifa Civil War gun grab narrative.
Oh, well, we would have been in a different world had this is the problem and why we need to really wake up to this with the election, because we would have been living under completely different conditions if Trump had been assassinated. There's no question in my mind. The state of the country that they would have plunged it into, and the people on the deep state side would have been thinking, aha, what a bold maneuver, and we removed our biggest obstacle or all the rest, and congratulating themselves. But it would have set the whole world on fire, in my opinion. So we dodged a bullet like Trump dodged a bullet by that much. And if anything, it should be a huge wake-up call for the future and what needs to happen. Yes, Ms. Sylvia.
What would have happened? I mean, what were they baiting MAGA to riot and to rebel? Where are they? They're fomenting a revolution, clearly. And it seems to me that regardless of who wins in November, that half of the country is going to be unhappy. And they would love a revolution from that, whatever half is unhappy.
There's no question. And yet, someone is going to take the presidency come November. So this is why I think that they have raised the specter of the assassination, raised the specter of the 25th Amendment. Look, I could show you a schedule, as I've pointed out. The schedule would read something like this. Every presidential election has had the debate season in the fall. So what they did by moving the debate into June and then having it be the sword that Biden would fall on, was they used Trump to take their own guy out. And then the next move was to take Trump out. Those are very, very Machiavellian moves. And for me, it shows the kind of treachery that's underway behind the scenes. Now, the fact that they did it and failed may make them back off a little, but in the grand scheme of the election, I think they still have plenty of time to throw the kind of surprise in. And for me, I don't think their plan has changed at all. So I think it is a season of assassination, although I'm hoping that we're able to avoid that as a country. And certainly with the warning now, Trump has his own security forces on high alert. For me, they changed all the rules by doing the Trump assassination. So now we're in a different trajectory. We're in a different scene. And if anything, the determination to remove the Democratic, uh, you know, regime should be stronger than ever. And picking apart the opposition, picking apart Trump because he's got Bitcoin backers or something, is one of the dumbest things. It's okay to analyze what's going on there, but to disqualify him, and not have a viable person you can put in there as president, just say, oh, the president doesn't matter, we'll deal with it on a local level. Some of the biggest BS I've ever heard in my life, frankly. It's not true. You have a body politic, you need the president, which is the head. And certainly he needs everyone on a local level and all the rest, but you need somebody in the presidency who respects the Constitution, or else you get things like the situation that we're in America.
Well, there's a karmic aspect to that also. I mean, we were talking about Excalibur.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And that, the head of a corporation, of a country, of a nation.
Absolutely. Yes.
You are, to a certain extent, linked with him or her and their karma.
Yes.
And so that's why it's very important.
Absolutely.
Who the leader is.
Here's a quick quote to close out our Hinckley thing. I was looking for this earlier. I finally found it. The FBI declined to release 22 pages of documents that included the names and associates of organizations linked to John Hinckley Jr. and the details of his finances. You have to really wonder about that. Congressional hearings. Oh, no, John Hinckley Sr. was deeply involved with World Vision, the nonprofit humanitarian organization that receives heavy funding from USAID, which is a CIA front company. That connection, I think, with Hinckley and Chapman is something that gives us the footprints of how these things operate. And certainly by the time we get into this situation with crooks, we have them putting this Patsy in the middle of this situation, and the Secret Service hearings and all the rest of this are still not addressing the fact that there are multiple shooters involved. So they're trying to pass the lone nut off in this situation. This is the thing that through our research, we won't let them get away with. I think that's crucial. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to take your super chatters.
All right, let me line them up here. Get to the beginning. Okay, Les Scott, Wolfgang McCarthy, Eurythmia's Fun, High Speed Chase, Axis Mundi Design, Joseph Fabry, Retro Renovo, Apulia 2001, Jay Parsons, Amarillo Gunrunners, Erica Swenson Elliott, John Folden, Mac Hike 57, Terry Doherty, C.A. Beverforden, Robert Scott, Alarmanine Bay, Roosevelt Media News, and Eurythmia's Fun. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. I'll do a couple of shout outs here. Of course, there is Cheadle with that ultimate paragon of virtue, Dick Cheney, after securing his Patriot Act. I mean, it's been a kind of incredible series of chapters for America. And if we make it through and come back into a, completely changed country, I think we can really look back on those dark periods as the ultimate training ground.
DJ, can I throw a question at you?
Yeah, sure.
Question for the crowd is what in the dark days ahead, and there will be dark days ahead,
yes,
in the chaos. What keeps you hopeful?
Oh, there's no question. The optimism around the future of America springs eternal. If we make the right moves, if we're aligned, we can be definitely aligned with that kind of heavenly calling of America. I think that's how it started, which was the Declaration of Freedom against the repressive King George. And, they were right. Our forefathers were absolutely correct to reject that oligarchy controlling them. And they sensed that freedom was the future and that the movement towards freedom was the future. And that's where we're going. There's no question in my mind, but the road to it could be, very harmonic indeed. I'll do a couple of shout outs here before we go. Happy Hermit, Cheney the Psychopath. I couldn't agree with you more. Johann Wolf, Rehoboth Farm. Joseph Farrell's out there. Hello, Joseph. I have some interesting things to discuss with you. John MC, Dow Jones Muller, Golden Warrior. Wow. Fantastic. Get Smart, Najat. Roger Claiborne, Freedom for the World. Boy, that's right on. Rumsfeld. Somebody mentioned Rumsfeld in there. Roosevelt Media News. Great to see out there, Roosevelt. Fantastic show, DJ and Olivia. Gracias, senor. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Corky Goss. Our best is from the past. Best. Interesting. Forefathers weren't deep state. That's really true. It makes a difference. Although I'll tell you one thing that Professor Scott convinced me of is by the time you got to the Lincoln assassination, there was a huge deep state operating already. Pervins Tarot. Thanks, Daniel and Olivia. Greetings from Germany. Hello, Germany. It's great to have you here. My goodness. Welcome. And CC is out there. Red Cap Goblin. Nina says. Dow Jones Muller. Fantastic ideas from tonight. And Miss Olivia, bravo. Great questions. Nicely done. We will see you all next week. And I'm going to work on this video presentation around all the pieces of the assassination coming to the surface. That's what's coming up. And we also have some exciting interviews and X series shows coming up for you in August and September. And this whole Berkner mini-series, documentary series about Berkner's secret coming up in the fall. You don't want to miss that. Make sure that you're part of the newsletter so you get all that. Like I said, at darkjournalist.com, it's free and it keeps us all in touch. And, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends. And Miss Olivia, never let it be forgot.
Once there was a Camelot.
Indeed. And there could be again. If it's not with Bobby this time, we get it through some other way, but it's certainly coming one way or another. And I would say this about Bobby. I thought in terms of his campaign, I wasn't running it down or anything like that. I think he's been a good candidate with good ideas. I just mean in terms of the reality of could he get into the presidency in 24? No. But I think with the right moves here now, and by throwing his support to Trump, I think he could in 28 be very well positioned to take that independent candidacy to the limit. And that would be exciting to see. And I'd like to see it, in fact. So thank you, everyone. We will see you all next week.
And your assignment is to watch the Parallax View.
Exactly. Jennifer and Bucks, it's great to see you. Kate Garcia, whew, fantastic. How terrific. David Tormina, great questions out there, sir. Thank you very much. Corky Goss. Somebody had something up here. Starfort Camelot. Isn't that interesting? I like that. Antisocial. Thank you, DJ and O. Thank you, Auntie. We'll see y'all next week. Have a fantastic weekend, everybody.
God bless.